Welcome back to Rum Tells Dogs, where every tale pulls at your heartstrings and reminds us just how deep the bond between a dog and its owner can run. Tonight, I have a story that will leave you thinking long after the screen fades to black. It's a story about loyalty, instinct, and the truth hiding just beneath the surface. Elmwood wasn't the kind of place you found on a map unless you were specifically looking for it. Nestled comfortably in a river valley somewhere people mostly just drove through. It was stitched together by familiar threads, a two-block main street with a blinking yellow light, a white-steepled church whose bell marked the slow passage of Sunday mornings, and porch swings that creaked in the humid summer evenings. Life there had a steady, predictable rhythm, like the slow tick of the grandfather clock in the dusty town hall. Folks knew their neighbors, maybe a little too well sometimes, and the local grapevine hummed with news passed over formica countertops at the highway diner or across neatly trimmed lawns. On the surface, it was the picture of American tranquility, though like any town, it held its share of quiet heartaches and secrets tucked away behind drawn curtains. John Miller was part of that steady rhythm. Not flashy, not loud, just John. A man maybe in his late 50s, early 60s, with kind eyes etched by time and a gentle way about him. He lived alone in a small clapboard house on Maple Street, the one with the slightly overgrown rose bushes. He wasn't a leader or a town character, more like a quiet fixture, the guy you nodded to at the post office, the one who always returned his library books on time. His life seemed simple, centered almost entirely around his constant companion, Max. Max was a handsome German Shepherd mix. Maybe some lab in there with intelligent eyes and an unwavering loyalty that radiated from him like warmth from a stove. You rarely saw John without Max trotting faithfully by his side. Whether it was their slow morning constitutional down to the river overlook or John waiting patiently on a bench outside the grocery store while Max sat, alert and watchful, tethered nearby. They were a unit, a quiet testament to the uncomplicated bond between a man and his dog. John didn't say much, but the way he'd absent-mindedly scratch Max behind the ears spoke volumes. For John Miller, Max wasn't just a pet, he was family, his shadow, his furry confidant in a quiet life. That's why the news hit Elmwood like a sudden clap of thunder on a clear day. John Miller was gone. The story that filtered through the town's nervous system was tragically mundane, an accident at home. Some said he'd taken a bad fall down the basement stairs while fetching something. Others whispered about a sudden, unexpected medical event, maybe a stroke. Details were scarce. Shrouded in the respectful quiet that descends after a sudden loss, shock rippled through the community. People murmured condolences, recalling John's unremarkable kindness. His quiet presence now a sudden, sharp absence. Casseroles appeared on unattended doorsteps, as they always did. The funeral was arranged with a kind of hushed efficiency. It was a somber affair at the Elmwood Community Church, straightforward and quick. Familiar hymns were sung. Quiet words were spoken about a good man gone too soon. And then the small procession made its way to the town cemetery on the hill overlooking the valley. It felt final. Done. Just another sad chapter closed in the life of a small town. Nobody paid much attention to Max during the service itself, beyond a few sympathetic glances. He was there, subdued, leashed by a distant relative who'd come into town for the arrangements. Just another grieving creature lost without his person. Or so everyone thought. The final prayers were said, the last shovelfuls of earth patted gently into place over John Miller's casket. People lingered for a moment, heads bowed, exchanging quiet words of sympathy under the gray, indifferent sky. Then, slowly, hesitantly, the small crowd began to disperse. Cars started down the winding cemetery road, leaving behind the scent of damp earth and wilting flowers. The distant relative, a cousin John hadn't seen in years, gave a final, awkward pat to the mounded soil and turned to leave, gently tugging on Max's leash. But Max didn't budge. He stood stock-still, ears slightly flattened, eyes fixed on the disturbed ground where his world had just been buried. The cousin gave another, firmer tug. "Come on, boy," he murmured, sounding uncomfortable and out of his depth. "Time to go." Max whined low in his throat, a sound of profound distress, and planted his paws more firmly. He leaned towards the grave, pulling against the leather strap, his gaze unwavering. He wasn't just sad. He was rooted, anchored to that specific spot as if by invisible chains. A few lingering townsfolk noticed the quiet struggle. Old Mrs. Gable, the librarian, paused by her car door, her hand pressed to her heart. "Oh, the poor dear," she whispered to her husband. "He just doesn't understand." Mr. Henderson, who ran the hardware store, shook his head slowly. "That John, he sure had a loyal friend there. Don't see loyalty like that much anymore." The cousin, flustered and clearly wanting to be anywhere else, tried coaxing, then pulling again. Max resisted, not aggressively, but with a stubborn, heart-wrenching finality. Finally, perhaps realizing the futility or maybe just overcome by the awkwardness of it all, the cousin sighed, unclipped the leash, and mumbled something about coming back for him later. He hurried to his car, leaving Max alone beside the fresh grave. And Max stayed. As the last car disappeared down the hill, he circled the mound of earth once, twice, then carefully lay down. His body pressed close to the soil, his muzzle resting on his paws. He faced the direction the mourners had left, but his attention, his entire being, seemed focused downward, into the ground beneath him. Those who glanced back saw the solitary shape of the dog against the fading light, a living statue of grief and devotion. Initial reactions were ones of quiet sympathy and admiration. "Bless his heart," someone might have said over dinner that night. That dog truly loved John. In those first hours, Max's vigil was seen exactly for what it appeared to be, the heartbreaking, ultimate display of a dog's unwavering loyalty to his departed master. A sad, touching endnote to John Miller's simple life story. One day bled into the next. The flowers left at the grave site wilted under the sun, then turned brown and brittle. The distant cousin never came back. Maybe he figured the dog would wander off eventually, or maybe he just didn't want the responsibility. But Max didn't wander off. He stayed. At first, kind souls from Elmwood would make the trip up the cemetery hill. Mrs. Gable brought a bowl of fresh water and some leftover roast beef, setting it down a respectful distance away. "There you go, sweetheart," she'd coo softly. Max might lift his head, his tail giving a single, weary thump against the ground, but he wouldn't approach the food. Mr. Henderson tried leaving a bag of quality kibble, the kind John used to buy. It remained unopened, ignored. The sympathy began to edge with concern. Max was visibly thinning. His thick coat lost its luster, dust clinging to the once glossy fur. His ribs started to show faintly beneath his hide. He drank rainwater from puddles when it rained, or lapped tentatively at the water bowls left for him, but his intake was minimal. Food held no interest. He seemed to be subsisting on loyalty alone, a dwindling fuel source. A week passed. Then another. The initial touching story of the loyal dog started to feel unsettling. Elmwood wasn't a big place, and Max's unwavering presence became a constant, quiet topic of conversation. People driving past the cemetery entrance would slow down, craning their necks to see if the dark shape was still there. It always was, lying down, head on paws, or sometimes sitting sentinel straight, but always by John Miller's grave. He grew weaker. His movements, when he did shift position, were slow, deliberate. Yet, despite the obvious physical decline, his resolve didn't falter. The grief that people initially saw seemed less like passive sorrow now, and more like a grim, focused determination. He was wasting away, a loyal soldier refusing to abandon his post, even as his own body began to betray him. The touching tribute was slowly morphing into a troubling enigma on the quiet hillside overlooking Elmwood. And then something shifted. It wasn't just the weight loss or the dull coat anymore. The quiet, sorrowful vigil began to take on a harder, more unnerving edge. Max was still weak, still refusing most food, but a new kind of energy started simmering beneath the surface, a tense, coiled alertness. It became most apparent when someone didn't just leave food nearby, but actually tried to step onto the grassy plot where John Miller lay buried. Maybe it was someone tidying up stray leaves, or perhaps a well-meaning soul wanting to place fresh flowers directly on the mound. The moment a foot crossed that invisible boundary, the lethargic, grieving dog vanished. In its place was a different animal. A low growl would rumble deep in Max's chest, a sound far more menacing than his weakened state should have allowed. If the person didn't immediately retreat, the growl escalated into sharp, frantic barking, loud, insistent, almost desperate. His ears would pin back, the fur along his spine would bristle, and sometimes he'd even show his teeth, lips curling back in a silent snarl. This wasn't just random aggression born of stress or starvation. It was targeted, focused. He didn't care much if people walked along the nearby cemetery path or tended to adjacent graves. But stepped towards John Miller's final resting place, Max transformed into a fierce, albeit frail, guardian. Even Mrs. Gable, who Max had always greeted with gentle nudges and happy tail wags when she visited John, was met with this sudden hostility when she tried to straighten the small, weathered flag someone had placed near the headstone. She recoiled, startled and saddened. "My goodness, Max," she'd murmured, retreating quickly. "What's gotten into you, boy?" He wasn't just mourning anymore. He wasn't just staying put out of loyalty. Felt different. Felt like he was protecting something. Or maybe warning people away from something. The passive sorrow had curdled into an active, almost frantic defense of that specific patch of ground, turning the sad enigma of the grieving dog into something far more puzzling and faintly disturbing for the quiet town of Elmwood. News travels fast in a place like Elmwood, faster than a runaway rumor down Main Street. And the story of Max, the grieving dog turned fierce guardian of John Miller's grave, became the talk of the town. It buzzed over coffee cups at the diner, got debated in line at the post office, and was mulled over during evening porch sitting sessions. The initial wave of simple sadness had crested, replaced by a ripple of confused fascination and low-grade worry. People still tried to help, of course. Elmwood folks weren't the type to let an animal starve, no matter how peculiar its behavior. Bowls of water continued to appear near the cemetery entrance. Someone left a half-eaten rotisserie chicken tucked into a plastic bag. A teenager on a bike might toss a jerky stick towards the grave from the safety of the paved path. But Max's reaction remained stubbornly consistent. He'd watch, wary and tense, as people approached. If they kept their distance, leaving the offerings well away from the grave itself, he might eventually creep forward after they were long gone. He'd snatch a mouthful of food quickly, nervously, or lap at the water, but always with one eye, figuratively and often literally, glued to that mound of earth. His posture never fully relaxed. He ate and drank like a soldier grabbing rations under potential fire. His primary duty, guarding, taking precedence over his own survival. More often than not, though, the food went untouched, attracting flies and ants instead of the intended recipient. The water bowls grew slimy. It became clear that Max's self-imposed starvation wasn't just about grief anymore. It was intertwined with this strange, protective stance. He accepted help only on his terms, from a distance that didn't compromise his watch over John Miller's final, contested, resting place. His unwavering focus on that grave, even at the expense of his own life, only deepened the unsettling questions hanging in the quiet cemetery air. As the third week began to blur into the fourth, the quiet sympathy Elmwood initially felt for Max started fraying around the edges like an old, worn-out blanket. Patience? Even in a town known for it, has its limits. Max wasn't getting better. He wasn't moving on. If anything, his strange, "it's just not natural," Martha Perkins declared one afternoon at the cut and curl. Snippets of gray hair dusting her shoulders. A dog grieving is one thing, but this is obsession. Poor thing's probably lost its mind. Her sentiment wasn't unique. The narrative began to subtly shift. He wasn't just John Miller's loyal dog anymore. He was becoming that strange dog up at the cemetery. People started avoiding that section of the grounds. Those with loved ones buried nearby complained quietly about the unsettling atmosphere, the periodic bursts of barking that echoed down the hill, the constant, unnerving presence of the gaunt animal standing guard. The concern for Max, defensive behavior, seemed more entrenched than ever. The concern morphed into outright worry for some, but for others, it slid into annoyance. The cemetery was supposed to be a place of peace, of quiet reflection. Max's periodic bursts of frantic barking, especially if someone unfamiliar strayed too close, shattered that tranquility. Families visiting loved ones nearby started feeling uneasy. There were whispers. Was the dog becoming dangerous? What if he bit someone? A child, maybe? Well-being remained, but it was now complicated by a desire for normalcy. Someone really ought to do something. "It's just not right," muttered Hank, the groundskeeper, leaning on his rake one afternoon, watching Max eye him suspiciously from 50 yards away. A dog belongs at home, not haunting the graveyard. The theory that Max had become a common refrain. He's starving himself to death up there. But underneath that concern often lay an unspoken addendum, and frankly, it's getting a bit much. Whispers started about calling animal control. Simply gone loco from grief gained traction. Poor thing's just lost his mind, people would say, shaking their heads. Grief can do funny things, even to animals. It was an easier explanation than admitting something felt it's cruel to just leave him there like that, argued Dale Schuster over fence posts with his neighbor. Maybe they fundamentally wrong about the whole situation. Labeling Max as crazy made his unsettling behavior slightly less. Unsettling could take him in, get him some help, sedate him or something. The idea gained traction. The touching. It put it in a box, albeit a sad one. But easier explanations didn't sit right with everyone. Mrs. Story had run its course. Now it was just a persistent, uncomfortable problem. A few even voiced harsher opinions, suggesting the dog. Gable still felt a pang of sadness, remembering the gentle dog Max used to be. Others argued he wasn't hurting anyone as was becoming a nuisance, maybe even dangerous, snapping at anyone who got close. The image of the noble, loyal companion long as you kept your distance. The town became quietly divided. Was Max a heartbreaking symbol of loyalty deserving of patience, or a growing was fraying? Replaced by the unsettling picture of an animal consumed by something incomprehensible. Something that Elmwood, a nuisance, potentially unstable, that needed to be dealt with? Inevitably, the practical solution started being voiced. More town built on the predictable and the understandable simply didn't know how to handle. The consensus was slowly building, for openly, someone ought to call animal control, became a common refrain. Or maybe the sheriff. They can't just let Max's own good, and for the peace of the town. Maybe it was time for him to be removed from him, waste away out there, snapping at people. The idea of forcibly removing Max from his post, sedating him if John Miller's grave. While most of Elmwood was settling into the uneasy consensus that Max was either tragically heartbroken or dangerously unstable. There was one person who watched the unfolding situation with a different kind of unease. Ben Carter wasn't much older than 20, working shifts down at the gas station on the highway edge. Saving up for maybe community college, maybe just a better car. He wasn't related to John Miller. Didn't know him particularly well beyond polite nods and the occasional chat when John came in for gas. Max waiting patiently in the old pickup. But Ben had a quiet, observant nature, the kind that noticed details others missed. And he'd always had a soft spot for dogs. He'd seen grieving dogs before. His own family dog, Rusty, had moped around for weeks after Ben's grandpa passed, sighing dramatically and losing interest in his squeaky toys. But Rusty hadn't turned into a snarling Cujo guarding the favorite armchair. What Max was doing felt different, more intense, more specific. Ben started making excuses to drive by the cemetery on his way home from work, slowing his beat-up Civic to watch from a distance. He saw the way Max ignored a rabbit hopping nearby. Didn't react much to cars passing on the road below, but instantly tensed, ears swiveling like radar dishes, the moment someone even paused near the perimeter of John Miller's plot. He wasn't just defending a territory. He seemed laser-focused on that 6-foot patch of disturbed earth. One afternoon, Ben parked further down the road and walked up, staying well clear of the grave but close enough to observe. He saw Max pacing restlessly around the mound, occasionally lowering his head to sniff intently at one particular spot near the makeshift wooden marker. Then, he'd lie down again, but not with the exhausted resignation of a grieving animal. It looked more like the tense posture of a guard dog on high alert, waiting for an intrusion. The growls and barks weren't just random outbursts of stress, Ben realized. They were triggered with pinpoint accuracy. Step here, near the path? Max might watch you warily. Step there, directly towards the grave? Instant aggression. It wasn't about the general area. It was about the grave itself. Max wasn't just mourning near John. He was reacting to the physical place where John was supposedly buried. While others were shaking their heads and talking about calling animal control to deal with the poor, crazy dog. A different thought began to nag at Ben. What if Max wasn't crazy? What if his intense, unwavering focus on that specific spot meant something? What if the dog, in his own canine way, knew something was profoundly wrong with what lay beneath the soil? The idea felt absurd, almost superstitious. Yet watching Max's relentless, pinpointed defense, Ben couldn't shake the growing prickle of suspicion. It wasn't just grief. Felt like a warning. Ben backed away slowly, his gaze lingering on Max's tense form. He got back in his Civic, the engine sputtering to life, but he didn't drive straight home. Instead, he pulled over onto the gravel shoulder just outside the cemetery gates, the engine idling roughly. He rested his forehead against the steering wheel, the cracked vinyl cool against his skin. Max's desperate, focused energy replayed in his mind. It wasn't grief. It was something else. Protective? Maybe. Warning? Definitely felt like it. He tried to shake it off. It was crazy. Dogs were loyal, sure, but this? Attributing complex knowledge of wrongdoing to a dog felt like something out of a kid's movie. Still, his mind drifted back to John Miller. Just another quiet guy in town. Ben pictured him pulling up to the pumps in his dusty blue pickup. Max's head sticking out the passenger window, ears flapping in the breeze. John always paid cash. Usually had a thermos of coffee with him. Simple routines. Then, a flicker of memory surfaced, hazy at first. It was maybe a week or so before John died. John had been getting gas, same as always. Ben had been washing the squeegee bucket out. John had stretched, rubbing his lower back. Getting too old for hauling junk out of that basement. John had chuckled. Spent all weekend clearing it out. Finally got it organized. Don't plan on going down there again anytime soon if I can help it. At the time, Ben hadn't thought anything of it. Just small talk. Idle chatter while the pump clicked away. But now, the official story was a fall down the basement stairs. The same basement John had supposedly just finished clearing and vowed to avoid? It wasn't impossible, of course. Accidents happen. People change their minds. But it felt off. A small, dissonant note in the otherwise straightforward, tragic tune of John's death. Why would a man who just finished a big clean-out complaining about the effort suddenly decide to go back down there soon after, leading to a fatal fall? It didn't quite track. It wasn't proof of anything, not even close. But coupled with Max's bizarre, unwavering, and specific defense of that grave, Ben lifted his head, looking back towards the cemetery entrance. Though Max was hidden from view now, the dog wasn't just guarding a memory. It felt like he was guarding a lie. That little comment John made, insignificant on its own, suddenly felt like a tiny crack in the official story. And Max, poor, starving Max, seemed determined to make sure someone noticed it. A knot tightened in Ben's stomach. This was crazy, right? Basing a suspicion on a dog's behavior and a half-remembered offhand comment? He should just go home, forget about it. Let animal control handle the poor dog. But he couldn't. The image of Max, gaunt but resolute, wouldn't leave him. He killed the engine, the sudden silence feeling heavy. He had to try. Just once. Maybe if he approached carefully, slowly, maybe Max would react differently. He got out of the car and walked back towards the cemetery gates, his footsteps crunching softly on the gravel. He pushed the rusty gate open just enough to slip through, the hinges groaning in protest. Max, predictably, was already alert, head raised, ears forward, watching Ben's approach from his position beside the grave. Ben kept his movements slow, deliberate. He didn't walk directly towards the grave, but angled off to the side, keeping a wide berth. He spoke softly, his voice calm and low. "Hey, Max, hey boy. It's okay. Just me." Max watched him, unmoving, a low rumble starting almost imperceptibly in his chest. Ben stopped about 20 feet away, still well clear of the burial plot. He crouched down slightly, making himself smaller, less threatening. He held out a hand, palm empty, showing no ill intent. "Easy, fella. No one's gonna hurt you." For a moment, nothing happened. Max just stared, his body taut, the rumble a low vibration in the quiet air. Ben took one small, tentative step forward, angling slightly, still trying to appear non-confrontational. That was the trigger. The low rumble erupted into a volley of sharp, guttural barks. Max scrambled to his feet, fur bristling along his spine. He lowered his head slightly, baring his teeth, the whites of his eyes showing. It wasn't the hesitant warning he gave distant passers-by. This was a clear, unmistakable threat. "Do not come closer." Ben froze instantly, holding his hands up slightly. Okay, boy. Easy." He hadn't even gotten within 10 feet of the actual grave mound. But it was close enough for Max. The dog wasn't just generally defensive, he was enforcing a strict perimeter around that specific spot. Any perceived encroachment was met with immediate, fierce hostility. Ben slowly backed away, step by careful step, never turning his back completely until he was a safe distance away. As soon as Ben retreated beyond that invisible line Max had drawn, the barking subsided slightly, turning back into the low, warning growl, but the dog remained on high alert, watching Ben's every move until he was back outside the cemetery gate. Leaning against the cool metal, Ben's heart was pounding. There was no doubt in his mind now. Max wasn't reacting out of confused grief or random aggression. He was guarding that grave with a specific, desperate intensity. He was acting like there was something incredibly valuable or incredibly dangerous buried there, something that definitely wasn't just the peacefully departed John Miller. And Max would starve himself, fight off anyone to keep them away from it. Ben stayed there for a long time, leaning against the cool, rusty metal of the cemetery gate, the low growl of the dog a faint, menacing hum in the background. His mind raced. He kept replaying the sequence, John's comment about the basement, the quick, tidy funeral, and now Max, starving, frantic, guarding that specific plot of land like it held the crown jewels. Or maybe something much darker. It all felt thin, flimsy. A grieving dog acting weird? A throwaway comment overheard at the gas station? It sounded like the plot of a bad TV movie. He could picture the look on Chief Davis's face already, that patient, slightly weary look reserved for small-town busybodies and folks whose cats got stuck up trees. Ben would sound like a fool. Maybe even unstable himself. People would talk. In Elmwood, people always talked. He pushed off the gate and started walking back towards his car, kicking at loose gravel. He should just drop it. It wasn't his business. John Miller was gone, laid to rest. Max was a problem for animal control, not him. But then he pictured Max again. The desperation in those barks. The way his ribs showed through his dusty coat. The unwavering, almost unbearable intensity in his eyes. That dog wasn't just grieving. He was sounding an alarm the only way he knew how. And nobody was listening. Everyone was writing him off as crazy or inconvenient. What if Max was the only one telling the truth? The thought settled heavy in Ben's gut. If there was even a tiny chance something was wrong, truly wrong, could he live with himself if he just walked away? If he let Max starve guarding a secret while everyone else dismissed him? John Miller, quiet as he was, deserved better than that. And Max sure as hell did. He reached his car, yanked the door open, and slid behind the wheel. He sat there for another minute, staring straight ahead, the internal debate raging. Finally, with a sigh that seemed to expel all his hesitation, he turned the key. The engine coughed to life. Instead of heading home, he pulled out onto the road and turned left, towards the center of town, towards the small brick building with the single flashing blue light above the door. The Elmwood Police Department wasn't much, a front desk usually manned by Debbie, who also handled town water bills, and Chief Davis's cramped office in the back. Ben parked across the street, his hands clammy on the steering wheel. He took a deep breath. This was probably pointless. He was probably going to make an idiot of himself. But looking back towards the hill where Max stood his lonely, desperate vigil, Ben knew he had to try. He got out of the car and walked purposefully towards the entrance, ready to tell Chief Davis the craziest story he'd ever heard. The bell above the door gave a tinny jingle as Ben pushed it open. Debbie glanced up from her computer monitor, a pair of reading glasses perched on her nose. "Afternoon, Ben. Everything all right?" "Hey, Debbie." Yeah. Is Chief Davis in?" Ben shifted his weight, suddenly feeling like a kid called to the principal's office. "Sure is. Back office." "Just knock," she said, already turning back to her screen, likely processing a water bill payment or typing up the weekly police blotter. Ben walked down the short, linoleum-floored hallway to the door marked Chief of Police. He knocked tentatively. "Yeah, come in," a gruff voice called out. Ben pushed the door open. Chief Brody Davis sat behind a cluttered oak desk, stacks of paperwork threatening to avalanche onto the floor. He was a man built like a retired linebacker, with a weathered face and tired eyes that had seen pretty much everything Elmwood had to offer, good and bad. He looked up, a pen tucked behind his ear. "Ben Carter? What can I do for you, son?" Davis's tone was neutral, maybe a little weary. It was late afternoon, likely nearing the end of a long shift. "Chief," Ben started, his voice feeling tight. It's about that dog. John Miller's dog. Max." Davis leaned back in his chair, the springs groaning in protest. He sighed softly. Yeah, the dog up at the cemetery. Heard folks talking. Sad situation. Animal control probably needs to step in soon for the poor thing's own good. He clearly thought this was just another complaint about the nuisance dog. No, Chief, it's not just that. Ben pressed, stepping further into the room. I mean, yeah, it's sad, but it's weird. Really weird. I don't think he's just grieving. Davis raised an eyebrow slightly. Okay? What makes you say that? Ben took a breath, trying to organize his jumbled thoughts. I've been watching him, Chief. He's not just moping around. He's guarding that grave. Like really guarding it. He lets people walk by on the path, mostly. But you try to get anywhere near John Miller's actual grave? He goes nuts. Growling, barking, showing teeth. Even at people he knows, like Mrs. Gable. Davis rubbed his temple. Son, the dog just lost his master. He's confused, probably scared. Animals act strange when they're grieving. It's sad, but it happens. It was the standard, reasonable explanation. The one Ben himself had tried to believe. I know, Chief, I know, Ben insisted, his voice gaining a little urgency. But it's specific. It's not just anyone getting close. It's anyone getting close to that specific spot. Like he knows. Like he knows something's wrong with it. Davis shifted, looking slightly less patient now. Wrong with it? Ben, it's a grave. John Miller had a tragic accident. We buried him. End of story. This was it. The crazy part. Ben braced himself. Maybe. But I remembered something John said. Just maybe a week before he died. He was at the station getting gas. Complained about hauling junk out of his basement, said he wasn't planning on going back down there anytime soon. Davis frowned. And the story is he fell down the basement stairs, right? Ben asked, meeting the chief's gaze directly. It feels off. Why would he go right back down there after saying that? And why is his dog acting like that grave is hiding something, not just holding his owner? Chief Davis stared at Ben for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Ben could feel his cheeks flushing. Expecting dismissal, maybe even ridicule. But the chief didn't laugh. He didn't tell Ben to get lost. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the cluttered desk. A comment about a basement and a dog acting strange, Davis said slowly, his voice gravelly. He picked up the pen from behind his ear, tapping it softly on the desk blotter. It's thin, son. Real thin. I know, Chief. I know it sounds crazy, Ben admitted, relief washing over him that he wasn't being immediately thrown out. But I can't shake it. That dog. He's trying to tell us something. I really believe it. The way he guards that spot, it's not normal grief. Davis stopped tapping the pen. He looked past Ben. Out the small window towards the town square, his brow furrowed in thought. He'd seen plenty of strange things in his years as Elmwood's chief, plenty of situations that didn't add up at first glance. A dog's behavior was hardly solid evidence, and a half-remembered comment was even less. But Ben Carter wasn't known for making trouble or flights of fancy, and the sheer persistence of the dog. The details Ben provided about its specific focus, it was enough to plant a tiny seed of doubt in the chief's pragmatic mind. All right, son, Davis said finally, his tone shifting from weary dismissal to cautious consideration. All right, let me chew on this for a bit. It wasn't a promise, but it wasn't a no either. For now, it was enough. Ben left the police station feeling a strange mix of relief and foolishness. He'd said his piece, crazy as it sounded. Now it was up to Chief Davis. Brody Davis sat at his desk long after Ben left. The pen still tapping softly against the blotter. A dog guarding a grave. A comment about a basement. 99 times out of 100 it was nothing. Just grief making an animal act out. Maybe combined with an overactive imagination from a young man with too much time on his hands. But Chief Davis hadn't stayed chief in Elmwood for 20+ years by dismissing things out of hand just because they sounded strange. Sometimes the strangest things turned out to be true. And that nagging detail about the basement, it didn't sit quite right. The next morning, instead of heading straight for the usual coffee and town reports, Chief Davis drove his unmarked cruiser up towards the cemetery. He didn't go in. He parked down the road, partially hidden by a stand of overgrown lilac bushes, and pulled out a pair of binoculars from under the seat. He found Max easily. A dark shape against the greening grass lying beside the simple wooden marker bearing John Miller's name. Just like Ben described. For a while, nothing happened. Max lay still, occasionally lifting his head, looking gaunt even from a distance. Davis watched patiently. A groundskeeper, Hank, started mowing a section far across the cemetery. Max barely reacted, just watched him warily for a moment before settling back down. Then, mid-morning, a car pulled up, Mrs. Gable, likely coming to tend her late husband's plot nearby. She got out with a small watering can. Max watched her approach the cemetery gate. As she walked along the path, keeping a respectful distance from John Miller's grave, Max remained watchful but relatively calm, just a low, almost inaudible rumble starting in his chest. But then Mrs. Gable paused, perhaps noticing a weed near the edge of Miller's plot. She took one step off the path, towards the grave. The transformation was instant, exactly as Ben had described. Max shot to his feet, barking frantically, hackles raised, teeth bared. He didn't charge, but he held his ground, a clear, aggressive line drawn in the grass. Mrs. Gable, startled, quickly stepped back onto the path, murmuring apologies to the agitated dog, and hurried on her way. As soon as she was clear of the immediate vicinity, Max's barking subsided back into the low growl, though he remained standing, tense and alert. Davis lowered the binoculars, a thoughtful frown creasing his forehead. He radioed Officer Miller, no relation to John, one of his 2 deputies. "Pete, you got a minute? Swing by the cemetery overlook when you can. Bring the good binoculars. Got something I want you to see." Later that day, and intermittently over the next couple of days, Davis and Miller took turns observing, sometimes parking further away, sometimes using the cover of trees. They saw others approach, curious teenagers, people visiting nearby graves. The pattern was undeniable, unervingly consistent. General proximity, wary observation, maybe a low growl. Stepping towards or onto John Miller's specific burial plot. Immediate, unwavering, fierce aggression. Max wasn't just randomly agitated, he was defending that 6x3 piece of ground with everything in his starving body. "Okay," Miller said to Davis after watching Max chase off a curious squirrel that dared to dart across the grave mound, barking with an intensity that seemed impossible for his frail state. "I'll give the kid credit. That ain't normal grieving. That dog's acting like he buried his favorite bone there and thinks the whole world's trying to steal it." Chief Davis nodded slowly, staring through the windshield towards the lonely figure by the grave. "Yeah," he said, his voice low, or like he knows damn well it isn't his favorite bone buried there at all. The initial skepticism had evaporated, replaced by a growing, troubling conviction. Ben Carter wasn't crazy, and neither was the dog. Something was definitely wrong up on Cemetery Hill. Now that Chief Davis was really looking, he started noticing things beyond just Max's defensive posture. Things that wouldn't have registered before. Easily dismissed as part of the scenery or the natural process of a new grave settling. One afternoon, parked downwind from the cemetery, Davis rolled down his window to catch a breeze. Along with the scent of cut grass and damp earth, there was another smell. Faint, elusive, but definitely there. It wasn't the heavy, unmistakable odor of decay he knew from grim experience, but something sharper, vaguely chemical, almost masked by the soil. He couldn't quite place it. He mentioned it to Miller. "Smell anything off?" Davis asked, sniffing the air. Miller took a deep whiff. "Maybe, kinda like fertilizer? Or maybe just damp dirt." "Maybe," Davis conceded, but he made a mental note. It wasn't quite right. Their continued observation also refined their understanding of Max's triggers. While any approach towards the grave set him off, he seemed particularly frantic. His barks reaching a higher pitch of desperation if someone's foot landed near the center of the mound, slightly towards the headstone marker. It wasn't just the perimeter, there was a specific zone. Maybe only a few square feet, that Max defended with absolute, borderline hysterical ferocity. It was as if that spot held the core of whatever secret he was guarding. And then there was the ground itself. Yes, it was a new grave expected to be disturbed. But Miller, who'd grown up on a farm and knew dirt, pointed something out one morning after a light rain. "See that patch, Chief? Right where the dog goes craziest." He indicated with a nod. "Looks like it settled funny, faster than the rest. Almost like someone dug there again after the main dig and didn't tamp it down quite the same." It was subtle, something only a keen eye or someone specifically looking for anomalies might notice. A slight depression. A difference in the soil texture that didn't quite match the surrounding earth. These small, nagging details, the faint, wrong smell, Max's hyperfocus on one specific spot, the subtly disturbed earth were adding up. They weren't proof of anything concrete, but they painted a picture that felt increasingly wrong. Back at the station, spurred by these observations and Ben Carter's initial comment, Chief Davis pulled the file on John Miller's death. It was thin, as expected for what seemed like a straightforward accidental fall. The report was written by Officer Riley, the newest member of the force, who had responded to the initial call made by the distant cousin who'd briefly surfaced for the funeral arrangements. Davis read through it carefully. Found deceased at bottom of basement stairs. Apparent fall. Blunt force trauma consistent with fall. It was all standard, but the timeline felt compressed. The cousin had apparently discovered the body, called 911. The coroner had made a preliminary ruling of accidental death on scene, and the funeral arrangements were made almost immediately. There was no mention of anyone else being interviewed. No detailed description of the basement scene beyond cluttered. And Riley, bless his rookie heart, hadn't noted anything about John supposedly having just cleaned that same basement. Davis frowned, rereading the brief paragraph. No mention of the state of the door at the top of the stairs. Locked? Unlocked? Broken? No mention of what John might have been going down there for, especially if he'd just finished clearing it. It wasn't necessarily negligence on Riley's part. For an apparent accident involving an older man living alone, it probably seemed open and shut. But now, viewed through the lens of a guard dog acting like a silent witness and subtle clues up at the grave, the report's lack of detail felt less like efficiency and more like a potentially significant oversight. The pieces weren't fitting together neatly anymore. They were starting to look like pieces from two entirely different puzzles. And Max, the starving, loyal dog, was the only one howling about it. Chief Davis leaned back in his chair, the worn leather sighing under his weight. He stared at the thin file containing the official end to John Miller's life, then glanced out the window again, towards the distant hill where Max maintained his lonely, increasingly desperate watch. It all swirled together in his head now, a confluence of unsettling factors that refused to be ignored. Max, eh? The dog's behavior wasn't just strange, it was extreme, unwavering, and targeted with chilling precision at that specific grave, that specific spot. For weeks, fueled by nothing but loyalty or some primal instinct, he guarded it against all comers, starving himself in the process. That level of intensity screamed that something was fundamentally wrong. Ben Carter, the kid, hadn't backed down. He trusted his gut, noticed things others dismissed, and had the courage to bring his crazy theory to the chief. His persistence had been the necessary spark. The scene, the faint, unplaceable chemical smell clinging to the air near the grave. The almost imperceptible disturbance in the soil right where Max was most agitated. Little things may be explainable on their own, but together, they felt like clues deliberately overlooked or poorly hidden. The story. John Miller's remembered comment about avoiding the basement clashed jarringly with the official cause of death. The accident report itself felt rushed, lacking the thoroughness Davis expected even for an apparent accident. Too many small questions left unanswered. The gut feeling, and then there was that. The indefinable prickle on the back of his neck, the low hum of unease that decades of police work had honed into a reliable, if sometimes unwelcome, sixth sense. His gut was telling him this wasn't just a sad story about a loyal dog and a clumsy old man. It was something else. Something darker. Individually, each piece was flimsy, circumstantial at best, easily dismissed. But woven together, they formed a disturbing tapestry hinting at a truth far uglier than a simple fall down the stairs. Davis knew what he had to consider next. It was a drastic step almost unheard of in a place like Elmwood. Exhuming a body wasn't something you did lightly. It required judges, paperwork, lawyers, and it invariably stirred up a hornet's nest of gossip, speculation, and potentially grief all over again for anyone connected. It was messy, expensive, and if he was wrong, well, Brody Davis would be the laughingstock of the county, the chief who dug up a grave based on a dog's barking and a kid's hunch. His career, his reputation in the town he'd served his whole life, would be mud. He weighed the potential fallout against the gnawing certainty that something was deeply wrong. He thought of John Miller, quiet and unassuming. maybe deserving more thoroughness than his death received. He thought of Max slowly dying on that hill, the only one seemingly fighting for the truth. With a decisive sigh that carried the weight of the decision, Chief Davis picked up the phone. "Debbie," he said when she answered, "get me Judge Peterson on the line and start pulling together the paperwork for a warrant for an exhumation order." Miller. John Miller up at the Elmwood Cemetery. He hung up before Debbie could fully process the request. Knowing the ripples would start immediately. By lunchtime, the whispers would begin at the diner. By evening, it would be all over town, spreading like wildfire through the quiet streets of Elmwood. Chief Davis was going to dig up John Miller's grave. The shockwave hit the town hard. Why? What did he know? Was it the dog? What in God's name was going on up on Cemetery Hill? The peace of Elmwood had just been definitively shattered. The day arrived cloaked in a heavy, overcast sky that matched Elmwood's somber mood. Word had spread like spilled ink, and though Chief Davis had tried to keep the actual exhumation low-key, a small knot of curious and concerned townspeople gathered near the cemetery gates, held back by a temporary police tape barrier. The air crackled with a nervous energy wholly unfamiliar to the usually peaceful grounds. Chief Davis stood near the grave site, his face set in grim lines, flanked by Officer Miller and a county medical examiner who looked distinctly uncomfortable being there. A couple of deputies and a small crew with shovels stood ready, their movements quiet and respectful yet underscored by the strange purpose of their task. Judge Peterson hadn't come himself but sent a clerk, a young woman clutching a clipboard who looked slightly overwhelmed by the situation. Ben Carter was there too. He leaned against an old oak tree on the periphery, watching intently, his heart pounding against his ribs. He felt a strange mix of vindication and dread. This was happening because of him, because of Max. What if they found nothing? What if this was all just a colossal, town-scandalizing mistake? And then there was Max. He wasn't allowed near the grave, of course. Officer Miller had managed to coax him into the back of a cruiser parked nearby, the windows cracked for air. But being confined didn't calm the dog. He paced frantically within the small space, whining, occasionally letting out sharp, distressed barks that cut through the otherwise hushed atmosphere. His eyes, wild and alert, were fixed on the activity around the grave, his entire being vibrating with agitation. He knew exactly what was happening, and his distress only amplified the tension hanging over the scene. At a nod from Davis, the digging crew began. The only sounds were the scrape and thud of shovels biting into the earth, the soft whisper of soil being tossed onto a tarp laid beside the grave, and Max's intermittent, frantic cries from the car. Each shovelful felt heavy, weighted with significance. The small crowd at the gates watched in silence, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and disbelief. Slowly, methodically, the earth was removed. The hole deepened. The faint, vaguely chemical smell Davis had noticed earlier seemed slightly stronger now, mingling with the scent of damp soil. The crew worked steadily, their faces impassive. Finally, a shovel struck something solid with a dull thud. A collective intake of breath seemed to ripple through the small group of onlookers. The digging became more careful now, the crew using smaller tools to clear the remaining earth away from the top of a simple pine coffin. It rested there in the bottom of the hole, plain and ordinary, yet holding the potential answer to the questions that had plagued the town, sparked by a kid's observation and a dog's unwavering, desperate loyalty. The moment had arrived. Chief Davis gave another curt nod. Two members of the crew carefully positioned straps under the coffin, ready to lift it to the surface. The air felt thick enough to cut with a knife. Silence pressed down on the Elmwood Cemetery, thick and suffocating. The rhythmic scraping of shovels had ceased, leaving a void filled only by the frantic whining and occasional sharp bark from Max in the nearby cruiser, a lone, desperate sound punctuating the collective held breath of everyone present. The overcast sky seemed to lower, casting the scene in a flat, gray light that bleached the color from the grass and the faces of the onlookers huddled by the tape barrier. Every eye was fixed on the simple pine box resting in the earth. It seemed impossibly small, yet contained the potential to either confirm a terrible suspicion or unleash a wave of ridicule upon Chief Davis. Davis himself stood ramrod straight, his face unreadable, but the tightness around his jaw betrayed the immense pressure of the moment. Further back, Ben Carter felt like his own lungs were seizing, the air refusing to enter. This was it. The point of no return. Time seemed to stretch, each second elongating into an eternity. The medical examiner adjusted his glasses. The clerk nervously shifted the clipboard. The digging crew stood motionless, hands resting on their tools. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The ordinary, peaceful quiet of the cemetery had been replaced by a palpable, almost unbearable tension, a shared understanding that whatever lay inside that coffin would irrevocably change their small town. The truth, or the crushing weight of a mistake, was just inches away. With practiced movements, the crew carefully lifted the coffin from the earth and set it gently beside the open grave. The wood was damp, streaked with soil. Chief Davis exchanged a brief, grim look with the medical examiner, then gave a sharp nod. Two deputies stepped forward, tools ready to pry open the lid. The sound of screws groaning as they turned, followed by the faint creak of wood as the lid was carefully lifted, seemed unnervingly loud in the heavy silence. Max let out another strangled bark from the cruiser, as if sensing the critical moment. The lid came free. For a split second, there was only stunned silence. Then, a collective gasp seemed to escape from the small group nearest the grave. The medical examiner leaned closer, his eyes widening slightly behind his glasses. Chief Davis's face, previously an impassive mask, registered a flicker of shock, quickly replaced by a grim hardening of his features. Because the man lying inside the coffin was not John Miller. The face was gaunt, unfamiliar, belonging to someone significantly younger. Perhaps in his late 30s or early 40s. His clothes were cheap, worn. There were no obvious signs of violence, but one thing was terrifyingly, irrefutably clear: this was a stranger. This was not the kind, quiet face of the man Elmwood had thought they buried weeks ago. The medical examiner straightened up slowly, pulling off his glasses and rubbing his eyes as if disbelieving what he'd just seen. He looked directly at Chief Davis. "Brody," he said, his voice low but carrying clearly in the stunned quiet. "That is not John Miller." The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. The implications crashed down on everyone present with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just a mistake, an anomaly. This was deliberate, calculated. If John Miller wasn't in his own coffin, where was he? And who was the stranger buried in his place? The horrifying answer was immediate, inescapable. This wasn't an accident investigation anymore. This was a murder scene. John Miller hadn't fallen down any stairs. He had been murdered, his body hidden, replaced. And the only one who seemed to know, the only one who had tried to sound the alarm, was the grieving, starving dog still barking frantically from the back of the police cruiser. Max had been right all along. The stunned silence at the graveside shattered instantly. Chief Davis barked orders, his voice cutting through the disbelief. "All right, nobody touches anything. Miller, secure the perimeter, expand that tape line way back. Get everyone out of here except essential personnel. Pete, get on the radio, call county dispatch. Tell M we have an unidentified deceased male, apparent victim of body swapping related to a potential homicide. Requesting full forensic team, county detectives, the works. This is now an active homicide investigation." The quiet cemetery transformed into a frenzy of controlled activity. More police tape unfurled, pushing the lingering townspeople further back, their faces etched with shock and a dawning horror. The small Elmwood PD was instantly overwhelmed. This was far beyond a simple local matter now. The medical examiner began a preliminary examination of the unknown body, his expression grim. Deputies started carefully documenting the scene around the grave. The investigation exploded outwards from that single, violated plot of land, branching into two urgent, parallel paths. First, who was the man in John Miller's coffin? Identifying him was paramount. Forensics would run fingerprints, check dental records against missing persons databases nationwide, collect DNA. Was he a drifter? Someone connected to Miller? Another victim entirely? His identity could be the key to unlocking the entire case. Second, and just as critical, where was John Miller? The quiet man everyone thought was resting peacefully was now officially a missing person, presumed murdered. The search began immediately. Davis dispatched officers back to Miller's small house on Maple Street, this time not for a cursory glance, but for a top-to-bottom forensic search. The basement, the one John had supposedly just cleaned before his fall, became ground zero. Every inch of the property would be scrutinized. They'd also start organizing search parties, combing the woods and fields surrounding Elmwood. Simultaneously, county detectives began the painstaking work of reconstructing John Miller's life, peeling back the layers of his quiet existence. The distant cousin who reported the death and arranged the hasty funeral was now person of interest number one. Where was he now? He needed to be found, questioned intensely. Everyone who knew John, however casually, would be re-interviewed. Neighbors, the clerk at the grocery store, old acquaintances. Anyone might hold a piece of the puzzle. They delved into his finances, bank accounts, any investments, debts owed or owing. Did someone stand to gain financially from his death? They explored his relationships. Were there hidden conflicts, old grudges, secret connections no one in Elmwood knew about? The simple, unassuming image of John Miller began to blur as investigators probed deeper. Perhaps his life wasn't quite as straightforward as it had appeared on the surface. Maybe the motive for his murder wasn't random but rooted in something complex. Something hidden beneath the veneer of his quiet, small-town existence. The gears of a major investigation ground into motion, casting long shadows over Elmwood. The initial shock was giving way to a chilling realization: a killer had walked among them, bold enough to commit murder and orchestrate a macabre cover-up right under their noses. And the only warning had come from the silent, unwavering loyalty of a dog. As county detectives swarmed Elmwood, interviewing residents and meticulously combing through John Miller's life and property, the story of how the investigation even began couldn't be contained. It was too strange, too compelling. Amidst the grim reality of searching for a body and hunting a killer, the role of Max, the gaunt German shepherd mix, still being cared for temporarily at the station where he finally started accepting small amounts of food now that the grave site was an active police scene, took center stage. Suddenly, Max's weeks-long vigil wasn't just a sad anecdote anymore. It was the crucial piece of evidence that had broken the case wide open. People started talking, really thinking about what they had witnessed. His relentless focus on that specific spot wasn't random obsession, it was because he knew something was fundamentally wrong there. His fierce aggression towards anyone approaching wasn't misplaced grief, it was a desperate attempt to protect the truth or perhaps prevent further desecration of his master's memory. Even if he didn't understand the details. His self-starvation wasn't just sorrow, it was the unwavering dedication of a guard dog refusing to abandon his post until the danger, or the wrongness, was acknowledged. Mrs. Gable, remembering Max snarling at her when she tried to approach the grave, shuddered, realizing he hadn't been angry at her but at the violation the grave represented. Mr. Henderson recalled Max's unwavering gaze, now understanding it wasn't emptiness but intense focus. Ben Carter, once hesitant to voice his suspicions, found himself retelling his observations again and again, his initial crazy theory now hailed as insightful observations spurred by the dog's undeniable cues. The narrative flipped completely. Max wasn't the poor, crazy dog anymore. He was Max, the dog who knew. The dog whose loyalty transcended death, whose instincts were sharper than any human's observation. He hadn't just been mourning John, he had been standing guard over a terrible secret, sounding an alarm in the only language he possessed, waiting patiently, desperately, for someone to finally understand. News outlets from nearby cities picked up the story. Loyal dog uncovers murder mystery. Ran one headline. Canine hero saves cold case, declared another. The tale of the devoted dog who refused to leave his master's grave, only for that devotion to expose a complex crime, captured imaginations far beyond Elmwood's borders. Within the town itself, Max became an overnight legend. He was no longer a nuisance or a problem to be solved. He was Elmwood's hero. People who had previously advocated for animal control to take him away now spoke of him with reverence and awe. There were quiet discussions about organizing donations for his care, finding him the best possible home once the investigation allowed. He had saved John Miller from being forgotten in a shallow, anonymous grave, and potentially saved the town from unknowingly harboring a murderer. Max, the silent, four-legged witness, had become the unlikely, furry heart of Elmwood. The intense investigation, fueled by the shocking discovery Max had prompted, eventually bore fruit. Forensic work identified the stranger in the coffin, a small-time con man with ties to John Miller's distant cousin. The cousin, tracked down several states away, cracked under questioning. The story that emerged was uglier than anyone imagined. John hadn't fallen. He'd confronted the cousin about embezzlement from a small inheritance John managed. The cousin, aided by the con man, had killed John in a panic. The body swap was a desperate, poorly planned attempt to buy time and cover their tracks, using the con man who had conveniently overdosed shortly after. Armed with the confession, investigators located John Miller's actual remains hastily buried deep in the woods miles outside of town. It was a somber discovery, but it brought a necessary, albeit painful, closure. Elmwood gave John Miller a second funeral. This time it wasn't rushed or sparsely attended. The whole town seemed to turn out, filling the small church and spilling out onto the lawn. It was a proper farewell, imbued with a sense of justice finally served and profound respect for the quiet man whose hidden ordeal had been brought to light by his fiercely loyal companion. Max was there too, sitting quietly beside Ben Carter in the back pew, no longer needing to guard or warn, just present. With the truth revealed and his master truly laid to rest, a visible change came over Max. The frantic energy drained away, replaced by a weary calmness. He started eating regularly, slowly regaining weight. The haunted, hyper-alert look in his eyes softened. He still carried the quiet dignity of his breed, but the desperate tension was gone. His duty, it seemed, was finally done. He could rest. The town didn't forget its hero. A small plaque was quietly added near the entrance of the cemetery, simply reading, "For Max, the dog who remembered." Donations poured into the local animal shelter in his name. People would stop Ben on the street, not just to ask about the case, but to ask, "How's Max doing?" There was never really any question about who would give Max his forever home. Chief Davis offered, of course, as did several other well-meaning families. But everyone knew where Max belonged. Ben Carter, the observant kid who had listened when no one else would, was the one. The day Ben officially adopted Max from the temporary care at the station felt like a small-town holiday. Max, looking healthier now, walked calmly out to Ben's beat-up Civic, hopped into the passenger seat without hesitation and looked straight ahead as if ready for the next chapter. Back at Ben's small apartment above the hardware store, Max explored quietly, sniffed approvingly at the comfy dog bed Ben had bought, and then settled down near the window with a contented sigh, watching the familiar rhythm of Elmwood life unfold below. He became Ben's shadow, his constant companion, greeting customers with a calm tail wag when Ben sometimes took him down to the gas station. He was a living legend, a furry symbol of unwavering loyalty, courage, and the simple, profound truth that sometimes the deepest secrets can be unearthed by the purest of hearts, even if that heart belongs to a dog.